All right, so chapter 10 is discussing escrow and title insurance. And if you've never actually been in a property transaction, you've never actually bought or sold anything before, some of this stuff may be completely foreign to you. New concepts, not even new words, like, we've been learning through the whole book so far, with all of this, theory and foundation about real estate. But particularly in this area, you would never deal with these concepts or ideas unless you're actually in the process of purchasing. So let me go ahead and share screen. We'll start taking some notes. And so in the past, at some point in time, you can think about the purchase of property, and maybe you have a seller and you have a buyer, and one person says, here's my money, and the other person says, here's the keys, and then maybe you grab the money and don't give the keys and you run away. Or you have to think about it. If you're exchanging dollars for keys, like, and you both walk away, maybe you're both happy. Like, what if something goes wrong? What if somebody didn't follow a particular law? Back in the olden days, maybe it was much more simple, right? So in essence, when we think about escrow and we think about the purchase of property, in essence, it's this thing, right? It's money. I'm going to pay you X dollars, and you're going to, in essence, transfer the property to me. You're going to give me the keys. It really does come down to that simple. To transfer property, and there's an earlier chapter about deeds, right? Grant deeds. To transfer property is relatively easy. You have to have one piece of paper, the grant deed, the correct writings, and details on there. Seller signs it and hands it over, and I mean, that's it. Transferring property is really that easy. But of course, real life comes into play. We're talking about the property, what condition is it in, who else might be using it, do I have all cash? No, I'm probably going to be using a loan. Well, then the bank, they want to have an appraisal done to make sure they're not overpaying for the property, and that they're not going to be, too risky situation for the bank. And so there's a lot of details that come into this process, right? And that's why the escrow process usually takes like 30 to 60 days. My quickest transaction ever, I think, might have been 9 days. But the buyer was buying all cash, right? So no lender, no appraisal. It was all basically paperwork, making sure that title was clear. And actually, coming to your earlier question, Kelly, about title, making sure that everything was okay in title. Now we can do this transfer of money and keys thing.
Gotcha.
I want to stipulate one kind of thing. We hear the word escrow. I want to do a little bit of clarification. So escrow is known as a process. So I want to define this a little bit. The escrow process is what we think about when what we're learning in principles here is that there's some sort of corporation, or maybe one of the brokers involved in the transaction is acting as the escrow officer. The escrow is defined as a neutral third party. So it doesn't really make sense in your brain, in my brain, that one of the brokers involved can be the escrow, but that's what the law says, right? So the idea that escrow is this process, or this neutral third party, they are the hub of action and activity in a sales transaction. Escrow contacts and deals with, for every transaction, at least, I don't know, a dozen, 20 people, maybe it's 40 people that they're involved with. So real quick example, so you can understand what happens in an escrow process. Seller signs the contract. Seller's spouse signs the contract, sends it into escrow. Buyer signs the contract. Buyer's spouse signs the contract, sends it into escrow. Buyer deposits money into escrow. Maybe there's a wire transfer happening from the bank with escrow. The agent is sending in paperwork to escrow. The broker is sending in paperwork to escrow on both sides. That's an additional, 4 people. Then you have a professional inspector who's sending in a report. The termite report who's sending in a report. Maybe the termite work is getting done and the clearance is going in. The disclosure paperwork, and the company that's running disclosures is sending paperwork in. The lender, the title rep, all of these different people are all funneling information into the escrow process and into the escrow company. This is the escrow process. Escrow's job, neutral third party, right? So let me go down here real quick. Step one is the contract. Escrow has to have a contract in hand to have escrow opened. There also has to be money from the buyer. This is known as the good faith deposit. And this is usually a couple grand. So we're going to offer to buy the property for $900,000, and we're putting in a good faith deposit of $15,000. It's a certain sum of money that's going into escrow to say that I am the buyer, I want to buy it. These are the terms, the contract is correct, and here's some money up front to show that I'm serious. And if something goes wrong and I breach the contract, buyer, the seller is actually owed that good faith deposit. Now, there's a lot of ways for the buyer to actually get the money back, but the idea of the good faith deposit is it's money for the seller. This is what opens up escrow, the contract and the buyer's money. Once this happens and both these things are sitting at escrow, escrow is considered open, and not the seller nor the buyer can call up and say, cancel escrow. It has to be two parties involved at this point. The next step in the escrow process is called escrow instructions. Now, this is not necessarily a step-by-step, step 1, step 2, step 3 instructions. We're not looking at building an IKEA cabinet or something here. But the idea of the escrow instructions basically explains the role of escrow, what they're doing, and it really reiterates the details that come from that contract. It's the contract between buyer and seller that is guiding this transaction. And it's escrow's job to follow those directions that come in the contract. So let me ask you, who does escrow work for? Remember, they're talking to buyers, they're talking to sellers, they're talking to seller's listing agent, they're talking to the buyer's agent, the selling agent. Who are they working for? It's a trick question. They're working for everybody. If the seller calls up and says cancel, the escrow officer is going to say, well, let me talk to the agents or let me talk to the buyer and see what their wish is in this. If both buyer and seller want to cancel, they sign the paperwork and it can then cancel, but it has to be both. The book does a pretty good job of this, although sometimes it's distracting, I think, in the book. There are different norms between North and South. So for example, here in the South, Southern California, right, and versus Northern California, it's typical that in Southern California that the escrow fees are split between buyers and sellers. It's typical in Southern California that the seller pays for title insurance. It's typical in Southern California that the seller pays maybe for a home warranty. In Northern California, oh, by the way, those are all negotiable. There are certain norms, but totally negotiable, right? I can negotiate in a transaction, in a contract, that we have no termite work done. The bank might want it, but as a buyer, maybe I don't want it or I don't need it. Maybe I'm going to negotiate that I'm going to pay you a higher price, but you're going to pay all of the fees, like the escrow fee and the title fee and all that other stuff, right? Everything's negotiable in the transaction so long as it's legal. But there are certain norms, right, that I already just mentioned, and those norms can be different in Northern California, Southern California. For the sake of your real estate exam, the real estate exam is for the whole state. So typically you won't see questions that are asking you, what is the norm in the South? What is the norm in the North? Because again, really, there are norms, but everything that's legal is okay. So there's not really like a one way to do it, if that makes sense. I also just want to focus in on this, and of course you'll cover this in your reading, but who can escrow be? And this is where it gets a little weird. but primarily it's a corporation, some sort of business, and this is kind of the norm, or it can be the broker. But here's the part that doesn't make sense, because we see this escrow again as a neutral third party. But for some reason, the law says that if a broker is going to be the escrow, it has to be one of the brokers in the transaction. It has to be the broker for the seller, or it has to be the broker for the buyer. I know it doesn't sound right, but that's the correct answer. And think of this escrow process as the manager. Oh, sorry. There we go. One more try. There we go. Think of this escrow officer, this escrow process, as being the manager, quote unquote, the manager of the transaction. So all of the stuff that's mentioned in that contract, the days before you have to remove contingencies, the days when you have to do the inspection, the days when you have to close the loan. It's a 60-day escrow. The buyer is allowed to do multiple inspections. The seller is going to pay for the termite work. All of those details and timelines all come into that contract, and it's the escrow officer, the escrow process that is managing all of those details. Now, they're not typically telling people what to do, but they're making sure that the details in the contract are followed. That's their job. Whew. All right. So that is the escrow process. I'm actually going to look at a timeline here in just a second. Actually, let's go ahead and do that now, and then I'll come back and revisit one other thing here. So what we saw here at the beginning of the escrow process, the start of the escrow process are these two things. The contract is in and the buyer's money is in. This is what we call opening escrow. So even though there's a contract between buyer and seller, even though there's signatures on that contract, and that contract goes into escrow, if the buyer never brings in the money, think of it as being it like the contract isn't, I can't think of the word right now. It's not completed. We can't open escrow without the buyer's money. That's part of the contract requirement. Once escrow is open, we have certain things like walkthroughs, inspections. That inspection could be a professional inspector, which is somebody that might crawl under the house or climb up on top of the roof or check the plumbing or check the drains, check the electrical outlets, look to see if the water heater is braced, the garbage disposal is working, does the heater turn on, does hot water come out, right? This is known as a professional inspector. Side note, really interesting, there is no licensing for professional inspectors. So you, right now, right, in this room with me, could tomorrow morning start a professional inspector business. Now, if you don't know what you're doing, you probably won't get very many jobs, right? You'd be a self-employed person trying to find people to pay you to do this inspection, but there is no licensing for it. So you don't have to have a license. You don't have to have a contractor's license. You don't have to have a salesperson's license. You can just go and inspect property. I know somebody that used to do this, and they have a history being an adjuster for an insurance company. So they had lots of experience with the guts, if you will, the insides of a home. Even though they were never a contractor, they knew how to kind of get dirty and look at things to see if they're working properly or not. So again, no standard. A lot of that work is gained by word of mouth and relationships to have professional inspectors. Any other inspections like termite, plumbers, roofers? It looks like some of that wood is messed up outside. The termite company's going to look at that. It looks like that pavement out front in the driveway is cracked. Maybe we have a contractor come look at that. So any inspections are during this certain period of time. The appraisal is also the big part of this. And again, I'll just kind of ask you again, who wants that appraisal? And the answer is the bank. So even though you, the borrower, are paying for the appraisal, $400 or $500 out of pocket, it's for the bank. And so if that appraisal comes in at your purchase price or less than your purchase price, the bank is going to adjust that loan amount based on the appraisal. It's the loan process that is the longest part of this. And this is why you can see that if you have all cash, this timeline really can shrink up if you want. So it's the loan process, all of the documents coming from the borrower, right? Thinking about tax returns, income statements, paycheck stubs, documentation of income is a lot of it. Taxes is a lot of it. Questions that come up from that. Documents that you're signing, disclosures that you're signing, all of those documents, when everything comes in and it's perfect, then it goes to underwriting and it sits on somebody's desks for them to review it. After it gets through underwriting, right, all of this is still the loan process. Title is happening, title checking is happening in here. Disclosures are happening in here. Buyers and sellers both. When the loan is approved, the bank says, we are going to give you the loan. There is something called funding. The bank funds the loan. It means they send the money into the escrow company. Then the last step of the process is called recording. And that recording process is when that grant deed we learned about a couple chapters ago, that grant deed gets recorded and it shows the transfer to the next person. And then it's also escrow's job after all of this is to do all of the accounting. So they take all the money that came in, they make all the payments out, paying off loans, paying the commission to the agents, paying the title company fees, whatever money's left over, right, for the seller goes to the seller. If for some reason there's in some of those prepaid stuff, maybe the buyer actually might get some money back if they put in too much to the accounting. And so all this accounting is done even after the fact, after the property closes. Escrow, the escrow company is still working on that transaction. So here's a snapshot of what an escrow process, the escrow company looks like. I want to give you one kind of different picture because we hear the word escrow in one other way. We hear the word escrow when you have a loan, and in that loan, you have an escrow account. So over here on the left, we see the escrow process, the escrow company that's managing that process. I'm also showing this other term called the escrow account. And what this is, it's the bank holding your money. Wow, I am all over the place right now. Sorry, it's getting late. I had a long day. This is the bank holding part of your money in the escrow account so that when your insurance payment comes due, you, the borrower, don't have to pay it. The bank actually, it's pretty common these days, the bank wants you to pay into this escrow account so that when the bill comes due for your insurance, the bank in your escrow account is holding this money. The bank actually makes the payment for you to re-up your insurance for another year. When your tax bill comes due, and again, this is 2 times a year. We're learning about that too, right? So 2 times a year when that bill comes from the tax collector, the lender makes that payment for you too. The money is held in the escrow account. Basically, you're paying into it to fund it. So when the bill comes, the bank can pay it. So here's 2 different ways that escrow is used. The escrow process managed by the escrow company, which could potentially be one of the brokers involved in the transaction, versus an escrow account, which is the bank's holding of your money for future payments. So that's what I wanted to discuss in regards to escrow. I'll leave this a little bit showing here, but we're going to move on to talk a little bit about title. And I'm specifying title insurance here. And the reason is because a couple of chapters ago, we also talked about vesting or taking title. The idea behind that term, investing and taking title, is how you own the property. Sole and separate property, community property, family trust, joint tenancy, tenancy in common, right? We talked about all those different ways to hold title. This is talking about title insurance. And so title insurance is a little bit different. The first thing that the title company is going to do is order an abstract of title, and it sounds pretty fancy, right? All it is in essence a report. It's paperwork. It is a history of transactions regarding the property. It also could be called a title report. It also could be called a prelim or preliminary title report. So the idea of the prelim or the title report is that this company, the title company, is looking into the past. They're looking at all the transactions that have happened on the property. They're looking at the different buyers and sellers that have been involved. They're making sure that any past liens had been paid, that maybe the current owner of that property also is paying the liens, the loans, checking to make sure that taxes were paid, maybe that homeowners association dues were paid, because if those dues aren't paid, then there's also could be a lien placed there. There's no contractor liens. We've heard about those too. And so really it's about this company doing some research and making sure that the title is clear. Clear title means that the property can transfer. I'm borrowing from your question here, Kelly. So clear title is that property can transfer. You nailed it. Versus a cloud on title, which could be a lien, again, lender, right from a trustee. Could be a lender, could owe a bank money. It could be that you owe a family member money and you recorded a trust deed for them. It could be a tax lien. It could be a construction, a contractor, mechanics lien. It could be, you name it, right? It could also, and again, remember, a lien is talking about money. You owe somebody money, and so they have an interest in your property. It could also be a cloud on title, could be the lis pendens, right? And if you don't remember what that word means, it means a lawsuit pending. So your teenage kid drives a car and crashes into the neighbor's garage and they sue you. That lawsuit is going to keep you from selling your property. You are involved in a transaction trying to purchase the property and the seller won't give you your money back. You sue them. Lis pendens, lawsuit pending, creates a cloud on the title. That property cannot change hands until that cloud goes away. Excuse me. So here's the idea again at this title insurance. Now, after the title company does this research, they issue this preliminary title report, this abstract title. At that point, everything looks good. Title insurance says, yep, let's do it. There's two main policies of insurance. Now, typically, again, here in the South, typically it's the seller that pays for this. And the idea behind that is that if you're involved in a sales transaction and you're selling your property and all of a sudden the future buyer, right, the buyer that owns the property and you move somewhere else, they sue you because something came up with title insurance or the title, something came up that was missing. And you're going, wait, like I don't even own the property anymore. Why are you suing me? This is where title insurance comes in. It's typically the seller that pays for it because usually it protects the seller. It benefits the buyer coming into the property, but really it helps protect the seller. Two main policies. There's the standard policy and the extended policy. I've pretty much explained what this covers already. The standard policy covers what the title insurance already looked at. The standard policy is the seller now paying the title company for their job, for this work that they did. They're paying for the insurance that the title is clear, that everything is good. Now, the standard policy is just paperwork. It's just the county records, maybe anything else that possibly wasn't recorded, but the idea that it's basically paperwork and records. It covers all of this stuff, and that's it. This is by far the norm. Because usually, especially when we think about Southern California, usually we have cookie cutter neighborhoods, and here's the house, and there's a property line, there's a fence on every property line, right? And it changed hands 2 years ago, and 5 years ago before that, and 10 years before that, and it just keeps changing hands, right? And it's pretty clear where the boundaries of the property are, the borders. And this normal standard policy is good enough in essence. But maybe you have a situation where it's not a normal property, or maybe the seller just wants the extra protection of the extended policy. And this extended policy includes an on-site inspection. And so this would also fall in line with one of those other inspections, but it's the title company actually coming out and doing a survey that shows, here's the property line, here's your property. Of course, at this point, if the title company is coming out and doing an on-site survey and something comes up, there's a problem, the title insurance probably isn't going to insure it, right? They're just going to say, nope, sorry, we won't insure this. But when you pay for that extended policy and they do come out and do it, you have that much more coverage. Now, the reason why this isn't the norm is because obviously it takes more time. There's more steps involved. It's not just about paperwork. It also is quite a bit more expensive. So a standard policy of title insurance might cost $1,000 or somewhere in that range. The extended policy is probably going to be closer for that same policy, maybe $4,000. A survey alone, to have somebody come out and survey your property, if you're just going to find a surveyor to find out and tell you where your property lines are, just that service alone is about a couple $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000. So that gives you an idea of how much more expensive that policy would be. And again, for most situations in Southern California, why it might not be necessary. Of course, if a seller wants it, they can pay for it. It's up to them. Or it could be negotiated. Maybe a buyer is seeing a potential issue on the property and the buyer really, really wants it. The buyer can ask the seller to pay for it. But it really comes down to individual kind of need on that property. So those are the high points from chapter 10. Again, talking about the idea of the escrow process managed by the escrow company and how this is different than an escrow account, which is held at the bank that you're paying your monthly payments to. We talked about the escrow process itself, kind of the start of that process being the opening of escrow. Again, needing the contract and the good faith deposit from the buyer for the opening of escrow, all the way through the process to the end, which ends with the recording. And the fact that it is this escrow company that is doing this accounting, even at the end, right? They're managing the process and making sure that the contract is followed, being a neutral third party. And with title insurance, again, primarily based on research of title transfers on a property. And after that abstract of title or preliminary title report is issued, the title company can insure that information. Again, here in Southern California, typically paid for by the seller, but of course, pretty much everything is negotiable in the real estate contract. The standard versus the extended, the one thing you have to remember here regarding a test or regarding the state exam is when they talk about it, the extended policy, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about an on-site inspection or a survey of the land needing to be done for the extended policy. So what that means is on the standard policy, the norm, the title company is never coming out to the property. There's nobody ever walking out to take pictures or whatever the property. Maybe the appraiser does that, of course, for the bank, but not for your title insurance. So that norm, again, just basically based on paper and stuff that has happened in the past to ensure that the title is clear. All right, hopefully that I restated all the concepts and used the words again kind of in context. So hopefully that can help you kind of grasp again those concepts. Great question. Thank you in the chat. Is the good faith deposit the same as quote unquote earnest money? And the answer to that is yes. Those two terms are used interchangeably. In the contract, the actual language I think is used as good faith deposit. But yeah, yes, you're correct. Is the same. Yeah, 3% of the purchase price. There are some norms. So the question in the chat, is that good faith deposit or earnest money deposit? Usually 3%. That's kind of a good guide. There are some norms, but there are some reasons why you might want to limit that. If it's $1 million property, you're putting in $30,000 into escrow. If something goes wrong in that escrow, you could lose that money, right? So there's reasons why you might not want to pay a full 3%, but that is kind of a standard kind of guide, I guess, if you will. And also it could change depending on the price range. If it's an 800 versus a $2 million property, right? That good faith deposit kind of shows your seriousness as a buyer, but there's some risk there. It also might change depending on the type of property. If it's an apartment building, like I used to sell, forget about a percentage, maybe it's just round numbers, like 20 or 30 grand. Even if it's a lower price thing, right? Or if it's a commercial property, maybe it's higher. So there's certain norms that might come into play when you're dealing with different types of property or different geographies, right? Different price ranges of property as well. Hopefully that answered all those questions. I'll go ahead and stay on here for a little bit longer to answer any additional questions. Thanks again for being here tonight.